Well, and can you mention here, because we talked a little bit about this before with some of the Qumran translation here, when we're talking about, the Septuagint doesn't always get it right, and they're making these changes.
Right.
Can we unpack some of the reasons why those changes exist? Because I know sometimes it's the reaction of they've changed it intentionally, and they're pushing the text a different direction, which does exist. There are instances where you read it and you go, this feels like they're trying to redirect this. But outside of that, what other possibilities exist for why those translations differ that readers should be aware of when they're reading this? Because it's not always a malicious change here that's happened.
Right. No, and this is, go get Emmanuel Tove's volume on
textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible.
Text criticism and how these redactional changes and how these editorial changes take place. Sometimes it is, I won't say malicious, it's a mean word, but sometimes it is deliberate.
Yes.
Sometimes
that's a great word.
Yeah. The redactors are making a deliberate change. And sometimes they're doing this deliberate change because they're just trying to update the language. This word we don't use anymore, so we're going to use a different word. Sometimes it is theological. They're trying to fix a theological problem. So we don't like what this says, so we're going to change it. Bart Ehrman talks about this in the New Testament all the time. It says, and after 3 days, Jesus, I will rise. And Mark says this, but Matthew and Luke are like, that's not what happened. So they say on the 3rd day instead of after 3 days, right? So they'll change just little things just to make it. That happens. That happens in the Hebrew Bible. That happens from the Hebrew to the Septuagint.
This is one of those, I think one of the great examples is that sons of God to sons of Israel change that the Septuagint makes. There's moments of theological discomfort. Yeah.
They don't like it, and they use the process of translation to fix a theological problem. Other times, it's late at night and the candle's getting dark and the sun has gone down, and, Dalits do look like Rashas sometimes, and they make a typo, it's with your hand, right? But they're copying and they miss a letter, right? They're trying to, the somic, is that a final mem or a somic? And they just copy the wrong letter, or they see the wrong letter as they're transcribing it into the Greek.
Or they hear the wrong thing.
They hear the wrong thing if they're, because that's another way to copy it, right? Somebody's reading it and they hear, it must have been a somic, but it's a sin, and that makes it a different word, and they're just not thinking, and they're going through. Other times, changes to the text can take place when a scribe will make a note in the margin. By the way, today we call this, the marginalia, right? And the next guy who's copying that document will think, that's not a marginalia. He just left that out, so I should include that. And now the text just got longer. So there's lots of reasons why the biblical text changes over time. But what we need to be honest about is the text changes over time. It changes within the Hebrew. It changes from translation to translation, Hebrew to Greek. This is all fact. We can lay them next to each other. The other one, by the way, the most common, I think, is that whoever was making this particular translation didn't know what that word meant.
Yeah.
And
I don't know the vocab. I'm not up to date on my vocab, and I've got to make a substitution.
They missed that day, and whoever they were going to ask stepped out, went to the bathroom or something, and he was like, I don't know that word. I think it's this word, and they wrote a word. But in doing so, they create an entirely new theological or entirely new interpretation. So if you don't use the right word for young woman, now all of a sudden you got a virgin given birth, right? And that becomes a new tradition. Or maybe they wanted to do something like this because that was part of that was acceptable now that you're in the Hellenistic period.
Yeah.
Because that's part of the mythology within Hellen. So there are many, many different reasons why translations get muffled, right? Take place. There was the Bruce Metzger book has this. The Bruce Metzger book, a lot of times for the New Testament, I forget the 4 things, but he lists them in the title. And then the Emmanuel Tove book, the text criticism, walks you through how you all get them in the Hebrew Bible and how you get them in the translation.
Yeah, I think it's a great thing to walk through because it is complicated, and sometimes I think more complicated than is presented, where an argument gets made of, oh, this has changed to this, and here is the reason why, and one option is being selected out of a multiplicity. And so typically scholars are wrestling through, and when they're making one of these arguments for it's changed because of this, they deal with, I don't think it happened this way for this reason and this way for this reason. But that doesn't always come across when we're just reading and you see a difference. Same thing with English translations, where a preference is being given to one manuscript over another and variations happen, that those things sometimes happen in the footnotes and aren't so clear.
Right. And keep in mind, the answer that maybe some of you watching are shouting at me, this is what we call the apologetic answer. Yes. It's the conservative, it's the I won't say fundamentalist, but it's the apologetic answer, and that is no. They use that word because that's the proper translation. That's the one that God wanted used, and this is the way it's supposed to be. This is the way it ought to be, right? And you can always argue that it's a theological document. People believe this document to be inspired by God. And so if it's in there, it's supposed to be in there. By the way, this isn't just a modern evangelical conservative Christian argument. Don't just blame them. This is a rabbinic argument, right? You have a lot of explanation in the rabbinic text for why there's an extra yod in there, right? Why is David spelled one way, just dalet vav dalet, right? And why does it have the plain A yod in there sometimes? They have explanations for why, things are spelled differently, and why they're. It's because God wanted it this way. The Shekinah comes in and does. This is not. We cannot just blame conservative Christians for everything. That's not how it works. This goes back to the 2nd century BC, right? There are theological motives in all parties for doing this. The Syriac Christians made changes, right? You see them in the Peshitta. You see them in the Aramaic Targums as things get translated from Hebrew and from the Septuagint into Aramaic. Sometimes they want to make a little change and then ramble off these.
Make an addition.
Christian Brady does this, and he wrote his dissertation on the I think it's a Targum of Ruth. And Ruth 1, right? You start off with this massive story about the 10 famines, and they just dump it in there, right? They want to. It's a sermon, basically. There's lots of reasons for adding these things, and of course, the apologetic answer is always that's what God wanted in there. As a critical scholar, no, but it is a theological document, and the theological preservation of this, you're going to find this in the rabbinic text and the Christian text. That's always a possibility. It's not one that I argue, but that's what a lot of people believe.